Hello everyone, my name is Scott Biegen and I'm a librarian at the Palm Springs Public Library. And welcome to part 2 of job searching in the time of quarantine, interviews. Alright, so as I alluded to in the title slide, this is part 2 of our job searching class, webinar, whatever it is you want to call it. We've already done part 1. Part 1 is already up on the Palm Springs Public Library's YouTube channel. And in that webinar class, whatever it is you want to call it, we talked about the coronavirus and we talked about job applications, resumes, cover letters, and references. So I assume you're good there, okay? But the thing is, if you haven't gotten any interviews and you have been applying for a while, you know what? You shouldn't start here. You should go back to part 1 and watch that first, all right? So if you're watching part 2, I assume you're good with all the stuff in part 1, okay? And that's okay if you're good with that. But in part 2, we're focusing on interviews, how to prepare for them, how to interview well, and how things have changed with interviews and the interviewing process during the coronavirus. Obviously, a lot of the time we're focusing on virtual interviews. And at the end of this, I will also talk about what you should do if you've gotten interviews, if you've interviewed a bunch of times, but you haven't gotten any job offers. What could possibly be going wrong there? So if you watched part 1, this slide should look a bit familiar to you. I'm just going to mention, and again, my goal here is to be honest and direct with you. I understand that if you're looking for a new job, it's likely due to COVID-19. And I used to give this presentation at the library in person. I did retire it in spring 2019. I never expected to be bringing it back in this fashion. I did think at some point I would need to bring it back, but not like this. The reality is things have changed overnight with the job market, and we swung from a market that was more geared towards employees, future employees finding jobs, where the ball was in your court, to being back in the employer's court again. And because of all this, yes, some things are the same, but a lot has changed very quickly, and how people interview today is very different from a year ago. We are moving much more towards a virtual interview process. One more slide that's a repeat from part 1, and it's worth repeating. You do need to look at yourself critically right now. I realize it may be quite stressful. It's likely very stressful and upsetting if you did lose your job due to the coronavirus. That is through no fault of your own. But now is the time to look at yourself critically and think about what your strengths and weaknesses are, your KSAs. And I'll be using that again and again and again throughout part 2, just like I did in part 1. Your KSAs are your knowledge, skills, and abilities. These are the diplomas and certifications, the things that you know how to do, the things you can show that you know how to do. And it's important that you know what these things are, because you will need to sell yourself to a future employer. And you need to know how to highlight what your knowledge, skills, and abilities are. Because if you don't know how to do that, no one has the time. No one has the time in HR to look and search for those things in you, because there are other people who are going to be able to showcase those things off right now. So you need to know what your strengths and weaknesses are. And if you do find some weaknesses, now is the time to correct them and learn some new skills. Maybe go back to school, get a new certification. There's time to do that. Not knowing your KSAs doesn't just hurt you during the application process or in creating a resume or a strong cover letter. It does hurt you in the interview process too, because no one at a prospective employer is going to read your resume and memorize it. You need to know what your KSAs are, because during the interview process, you need to keep bringing them up again and again and again and highlighting what your biggest selling features are, so they can see that you're a good fit for whatever position it is that they're hiring for. The purpose of an interview, I think many people would say that it's to get the job, right? And maybe right now that is what it needs to be. because maybe you just need money, or you need work experience, or you need to get back into the workforce. And honestly, it is easier to get a job if you are currently employed. That's the truth of how the world works. I'm sorry. But I don't think this is solely the best way to look at this. I mean, I get it if you need money, but this isn't the healthiest or best way to look at what the purpose of an interview is. A better way to look at this is to see if the position is a good fit. Now notice, I'm not saying that you are just a good fit for the company or the employer. It's not just about the company or the employer, it's also about you. The interview process is a two-way street, and yes, you want to impress the prospective employer, but also they should be trying to impress you too. And so you'll want to look for red flags throughout the process. Yes, this is a new process for everyone. COVID-19 has changed everything, so be a little bit flexible, be a little bit understanding. But, speed bumps or errors in communication could be indicative, if they show up often enough, of what it's like to work for the company. So be aware of that. You're important too, right? And what you want is important. They need to work to impress you. So hey, you've got an offer to interview, or someone's calling you to schedule an interview, or you've got an email to schedule an interview. What is it that you do? So in scheduling the interview, you know what? It's okay to not respond immediately or to answer the phone call. It's okay. It's okay to let the phone call go to voicemail. And you might not always know it's from a prospective employer, but sometimes you do. You notice that area code, hey, that's from the city where I applied that job for. It's okay to not respond immediately, and sometimes it might be better actually to give it a little bit of time. Not a lot of time. You should respond within 24 hours. If you can respond within a few hours, great, but don't stress about it too much. 24 hours is reasonable. But the reason why I want you to take a little bit of time here is so you can compose yourself, especially if it is a phone call, and maybe get to a quiet place. Answering such a phone call at the grocery store maybe isn't the best place to do that, or at work even. Maybe you can't freely talk about whatever it is at your desk. So taking a little bit of time allows you to compose yourself and think about how you want to respond, and maybe look at your availability so you feel comfortable in that phone conversation or emailing back. Now, part of the thing here is that I want you to also have some questions ready for the phone call. I want you to have some questions that you put in the email. And the two questions I always recommend asking, well, the first one, is there anything special I need to prepare in advance for? A lot of times they'll tell you that, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z for the interview. But sometimes they might not say that. And through asking this question, you might hear that they want you to bring a portfolio. Or they may say, please don't bring a portfolio. It's helpful to know what to bring and what not to bring, right? So there aren't any surprises. The second question is super helpful. Who will I be interviewing with? And mind you, asking these types of questions too shows that you're interested in the job. A lot of people don't ask questions other than time and date and where do I need to be. That question about who will I be interviewing with, that will tell you how many people, or roughly how many people will be in the interview and who they are. And sometimes they'll tell you what the job titles are too. So that way you know better how to prepare. And so if you're given one person's name and one person's job title, that tells you it's likely going to be a one-on-one interview. Sure, they could pull one or two people into the interview with you, and you need to be mentally prepared for that. But it's not likely to turn into an interview with 10 people. Now, if they give you a list of 7 names, that tells you it's a committee interview, right? and how you might mentally prepare for that is different than you would if they just gave you one or two names. So who will I be interviewing with is super helpful. And by the way, in my experience applying for jobs and interviewing, most HR professionals are really, really helpful in giving this information. They want candidates to succeed. They really do. So what if they're not helpful in answering your questions about the interview? Well, I have to be honest, nearly every employer I've ever scheduled an interview with has been helpful. I only had one time in all the times I've interviewed where they weren't helpful with this type of information. And what happened is I asked who I would be interviewing with. And then I just didn't get a response. A few weeks passed, and suddenly it was the day of the interview, and they still hadn't gotten back to me. And at that point, I noticed a lot of other little red flags, and with that one, that was a giant red flag for me personally. And what ended up happening is they let me know a few minutes before the interview started, which wasn't particularly helpful to me, and maybe that's what they intended, but it seemed really off-putting for me, and I didn't care for their interview process or how they communicated with me, which was basically no communication at all. I mean, they could have at least just said something when I asked. So ultimately what happened is after I interviewed, I withdrew my application. And I was polite about that, but that's what I chose to do. Now, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying that's what I did, and that was the right choice for me. So in a future slide, I'll talk about questions you ought to ask if someone wants to interview you on site during the pandemic. So that's not what this slide is about. I'm talking about how you discuss your personal life during an interview, or even through the entire interview process, which is why I'm bringing it up now. Okay? And typically you shouldn't talk a lot about your personal life at all during the interview process, and that's pre-pandemic. But during the pandemic, I think you ought to be even more discreet about the activities you're engaging in. And that's because due to messaging from the government, people feel differently about what they feel comfortable doing and what they don't feel comfortable doing. And a lot of people feel really strongly about those ideas. I remember years ago, someone asked me after the interview was over what I was going to do after the interview. And I said, I'm going to go to the beach. That was a fine response back then. Today, I wouldn't say that. And the reason why I wouldn't say that is because, well, some people would be okay with that response. Some people might think, oh, he should be going home. And you don't always know who those people are, if that makes sense. And I don't want you to not get a job offer because you accidentally reveal something that is legal to do. Right now, when I'm recording this, it's legal to go to the beach. It is. But some people might feel differently about people going to the beach. Does that make sense? And the same goes with restaurants, shopping, all those things. Some people might feel differently than you do about those activities, whether they're legal or not, or what have you, they might feel differently. So I don't want you to get any blowback from that. And yes, people could be silently judging you when you're revealing this information. So hold back a little bit more today. Most interviews are obviously scheduled in advance, and ideally they should be, but some people do like to just call people and see if they want to interview right then and now over the phone. Doesn't happen very often, but it's worth thinking about how you would react to that. And you certainly can ask to schedule at a better time for you. The reality is you could be doing anything. You could be grocery shopping, and maybe that's not where you want to do an interview. So don't be afraid to tell them, hey, this doesn't work for me right now. But of course, if you feel comfortable and you want to roll with it, go with it. I do think it's worth reminding that even at this stage of the process where you're scheduling an interview, you are being observed by the prospective employer. So do monitor your communication and how you're presenting yourself, and do follow instructions as they are given to you. But also, like I keep saying, this is a two-way street. You should be observing them too. And while I do think there should be a little bit extra leeway given, maybe somebody doesn't get back to you because, well, maybe they're sick. Think about that for a moment. Just look at what's going on, and make mental notes to yourself when you see things that could be red flags. And if you start to see them piling up, that might mean this is a no for you. But overall, regardless of what you decide to ultimately do, be professional, polite, responsive. Respond, in a timely manner, and do spell check your emails. Okay? Of course, it is okay to decline interviews. Of course you can. I do think it's probably in your best interest to accept most invitations to interview. Why? Well, interviews are practice, and the more you practice at something, the better you get at it. And even if you have a job that you love and really have no intention of leaving, sometimes it's good to apply for jobs periodically just to keep your skill set fresh. And that way you can also see if your updated resume and cover letter and what have you still get you interviews. But then if you are offered an interview, it's good to keep that practice up. But don't ghost people. Please don't do that at any stage of the process. Communicate. I understand that oftentimes employers might drop prospective candidates sometimes, and they do quote-unquote ghost people in doing that. But that doesn't mean that you should. You should always communicate when you're not going to show up for an interview, or when you're going to decline an interview, or when you're going to bow to the process. Be polite and to the point, but do communicate what you're doing. It's just being professional, right? And if you do have to decline or withdraw, give a brief reason why, something that makes sense. It doesn't have to be the real reason, of course, but yeah, just let them know if you do have to decline the interview. So if you watched part 1 of this job searching class, you'll remember that I told you only to apply for a handful of jobs every week, just simply because you don't have the time to do a good job and apply for 8 jobs. Just 1 or 2 is enough because you're targeting your materials for each position you're applying for. That being said, if you are going to interview with an organization, that should take priority over applying for new jobs unless there's something that really stands out to you. So what does preparing for an interview mean? It means doing research on the company. Look and see what's going on with the company. That means doing a web search. Look really closely at what's on the company's website, organization's website. Look at what they are doing with the community. And if you can bring up some points that come from that research during the interview, that shows initiative and that you care about the job. At some point, it's a good idea to send your references an email to let them know that you're going to interview somewhere, so they aren't surprised if they get a phone call from the prospective employer. And also, review the job posting and your application materials. Remember, in part 1, I suggested that you print off the job posting and keep track of your applications and have a folder on each job. You'll want to look at that job posting so you can know what the company is asking for, and you can bring up important points during the interview. If you haven't printed it off, it's possible that that job posting could have disappeared from the internet. Sometimes you're asked to do something for an interview, as in to create something or present something. If you are asked to complete a task, treat it like it's a final exam. Take time to shine. If you know that you can do a better job than anyone else, show that you can do a better job than anyone else. I've heard some job advice people say, oh, don't worry so much about this. It's not really that big of a deal. Really? If they ask you to do something, I think it's a really big deal. And if you can show them that you're better than the other people at doing this task, I think you're likely to be offered the job. So take time. Make sure you really shine with whatever it is that they ask you to do. So it's a good idea to figure out what kind of salary you're looking for and to do some research on what your value is in terms of money. And so you'll need to do some research on what salaries and rates go in your field. And you'll want to have that before you begin interviewing. You want to have all that in mind. There are some recent developments of the last few years in California. The salary history request, which used to be really common, isn't legal anymore. They can't ask for what your hourly rate was or how much money you made in your previous positions. And that's to protect you because it could have locked you into a lower pay rate or salary rate based on your previous work history. So that's good. That's really good. And employers must also provide a pay scale for a position upon request. But they're only actually required to do that after the first interview. So you shouldn't bring that up before you interview. Does that make sense? And so because of these new rules, most employers will post the pay scale on the job posting. And that just makes everything easier because if the range is too low, you just move on and don't bother applying. That saves everybody time. But like I said, if they don't provide it after that first interview, you can ask and just be short and to the point. There's no need to lecture them or anything like that. Just ask. All that being said, though, and while I don't particularly agree with this, some employers do seem to have some issues with the prospective employee bringing this up on their own. And some people feel that you're being a little too greedy. You want money. Well, of course you do. Working for a company or an organization is a two-way street. You're not just there to help out. You're not volunteering. And you're there to make money. You want to have food on the table. You want a roof over your head, right? And a good employer should want you to have those things. So I don't think there should be any issue with you talking about benefits and pay scale. And while they can't ask for specifics about the history about those things, about how much money your benefits were worth or how much money you made, I do think you should be able to ask them about their willing to offer you. But I do think it's best to tread a little bit lightly and be a little careful because you don't always know who feels this way. Even though there's a law that you can ask for this, some people might still think you're being a little too pushy. And so you shouldn't be like Jerry Maguire and yell at anybody or force this conversation. I think if you've interviewed, it will develop naturally in most cases. But again, if it doesn't, if you have issues with this type of thing, that could be a little bit of a red flag. A good employer should want you to not have to worry about putting food on the table and if you have a roof over the head. They should want you to be financially sound because that makes you a better employee. Preparing for interviews, as I've been alluding to, is really important, but remember that you really need to know your KSAs because most interview questions will be about your KSAs, even if they don't seem like they're about your KSAs. And a good way to do that is just simply through practice and finding sample interview questions. Sample interview questions are super easy to find. Just Google interview questions. That's all you need to do. And it's okay if some of those interview questions are bad interview questions. Now, what do I mean by that? A good interview question typically will draw out your knowledge, skills, and abilities and will seem directly connected to the job posting. Bad interview questions might be more difficult to answer because they're vague or don't seem relevant and aren't really asking you about your knowledge, skills, and abilities. You need to know how to answer both because some people aren't great interviewers and they might ask you bad questions. And that's not necessarily a red flag, it just means the person isn't a great interviewer. And think about it, they might not do this very often in their job. But you need to be able to show your knowledge, skills, and abilities, and you need to be able to work with bad questions. You really do. Okay? So you'll need to find a way to respond in a way that draws out those knowledge, skills, and abilities and highlights what a great fit you are for this particular posting. Now, I do recommend that you practice alone at first, but over time, I think it's a good idea to have a friend or group of friends interview you. If you're, per se, looking for a panel interview, have multiple people interview you at the same time. And today, during the pandemic, you could do all that through FaceTime, Skype, or Zoom. It's super easy. And that friend, regardless of what their background is, can provide you with some basic feedback, of course. If you say, it's not that I'm lazy, it's just that I don't care, they can tell you that's not a good response to have. And the reality is most of the people you will directly interview with aren't going to be HR professionals. They may have had some training because they're a manager or something like that, but they're not going to be a career HR professional. Do keep your friend's advice in context, though. If they are someone who works in HR or has management experience or hiring experience, and they work in your field or any combination of those things, their advice might be really relevant and you want to listen to it very carefully. You do. But if they don't have that type of experience, okay, listen to it because it is feedback, but trust your gut maybe a bit more. Sometimes you might have to disregard bits and pieces of what they're saying just simply because they don't have that experience. If they've never interviewed someone, they might not know per se any more than you do if you haven't interviewed someone. So you should always trust your gut, but if they're someone who has experience in interviewing or HR, really, really, really listen. Okay? But if they're a friend, still they're helping you out. I mean, feedback still could be relevant if they don't have that experience. So one of the most common interview questions that you definitely should practice for isn't actually a question. And sometimes it disguises itself as another phrase or an actual question. But basically it's the famous tell me about yourself. And typically this is the first thing they will ask you. And even if it doesn't sound like this, oftentimes the first question is tell me about yourself disguised as something else. In my experience, people especially don't have a lot of practice interviewing just start talking about their lives. They talk about their families, things that are important to them. And that's not actually what this question is asking you about. This is about your KSAs. And because the question is so common, especially if you get nervous, I would recommend having an outline or a brief set of bullet points detailing the things that you want to bring up for tell me about yourself. And that will include the education, the certifications you have, basic job experience, knowledge, skills, and abilities, especially if they were talked about in the job posting. Make sure you talk about them here. It's basically a way to remind the people interviewing you of all the great things that are in that resume that they called you in for to talk to you about. So probably the worst question that can be asked, and it's a really common question, is what's your greatest weakness? What's your greatest strength? That might be a better question, but what's your greatest weakness is not a good question because you can't really be honest. I'm always running late. No, you can't say that, right? I'm forgetful. I can't say that either. And I actually heard someone one time say, I don't have any. Oh, no, you can't say that. That comes across as arrogant. Of course you have weaknesses, but it doesn't really illuminate anything about the job that you're applying for or what you can do because you can't really be honest with it. So what I recommend if you are asked this question is, don't tell them it's a bad question, by the way. Just tell them something like this. With all the new developments in my field, I find it difficult to keep up. So I take time every week to read up on different articles and new developments in my field so I can at least keep up with what's going on. Do you see how that worked? So you said what the issue was, a pretty common issue by the way, and then you said how you were dealing with it. You could also choose to be funny, like, I make terrible coffee, or I don't know how to fix the copy machine. Okay? So you'll have to figure out how you want to answer it. I would choose the first one actually. I think that's a good way to answer that. But the greatest weakness question, not really helpful to anyone. So a lot of really great interview questions might ask you to actually apply the things that you know. They might ask you to apply your knowledge, skills, and abilities to a scenario or a given situation. What would you do if this happened? One time I was given a list of hypothetical events happening in a hypothetical library that I was managing. And all these things were happening at the same time. And I was asked to prioritize them. What order would I deal with them and how would I deal with them? That's a really, really good question because it reveals how I think. And so I just went through point by point why I would do this first, why this would come second, why this would come last. And I explained why I was doing it that way. And right at the very top was a safety issue. So that's why I went at the top. And what was good about the question is it placed me in a scenario that could actually occur. So when you're given these types of questions, explain why you're going to do it. That's really, really important. Some really formal processes with interviews that are heavily HR driven might actually give like a sample answer to each of the interviewers, and they'll be asked to grade based on that answer, but you won't know what that is or if they're actually doing that, okay? But the thing is, it is really important to explain why you're doing X, Y, and Z, because there isn't usually one right answer. There are a lot of right answers, and there could be a lot of wrong answers too. Also, don't be afraid to hear a question again, or for them to repeat the question back to you. You can do those things. And sometimes they can help you steal a little bit of time to formulate your response. A lot of times I also like to ask, does that answer your question when I'm finished answering? Because there could sometimes be something that I overlooked. And people, I would hope, would realize you're a human being and aren't perfect. No one is, right? So that can help the conversation keep going because maybe you did overlook something and they can help you find it out. If for whatever reason you remember a few minutes later you overlook something, if there's a period of time which you're given to say something, bring that up. Say, hey, I should have mentioned X, Y, and Z, earlier. So the vague interview question, that can be one of the most difficult questions to get. And if you're just getting a few of them, it might be because the person interviewing you doesn't know how to interview you. Or anyone, actually. That might be what's going on. But sometimes it's actually intentional. And when it's intentional, it could be because HR has been asked to step in to the hiring process. And usually this could be for a government entity, but it could be for an organization. It might be because there have been issues with hiring before, as in Suki hired her best friend Sally to head the IT department, and Sally had never used a computer before. Okay, so that's the type of scenario that has sometimes happened, and so HR has had to step in. And sometimes HR steps in a little bit too much, and the questions are all canned and made beforehand, and sometimes given by people who you would not work with in the position if you're hired. And sometimes the people asking you the questions, they may not even work in your field or have knowledge of your field. So that can be difficult because they won't know what you're talking about sometimes. And The questions themselves, they may not be able to deviate from them. Maybe they're only allowed to ask the questions as they are, no follow-up questions, and that includes you too. You may not be able to ask follow-up questions about anything that's happened there. And so it's hard to do well in these types of interviews, but the trick is if the questions are vague, a light bulb needs to go off and you need to focus on your KSAs. You need to drill those home during this interview. You do. Now, of course, you may not like this interview process, and that could be a red flag. And so remember, this is a two-way street, right? It's not just about you making good impression, they should be making good impression too. And if you find the interview process off-putting, if you find them evasive, not answering your questions, those could be red flags. And the interview process, the employment process, the application process, all that can reveal a lot about the culture of the employer. Sometimes things happen, maybe somebody gets sick, and somebody doesn't get back to you right away. But the thing is, if you keep seeing all these red flags that keep showing up again and again and again, think about what it might be like to work for them, right? This is a period of time in which they should be putting their best foot forward, just like you are, right? And so issues that typically show up now oftentimes show up after you're hired too. Now, some questions are a little tricky, and I think maybe one of the most difficult ones to answer right now is, well, your employment status, especially if you're currently unemployed. And so the best way to handle questions like this is actually to have a canned response and to have practiced. And I mean practice. Practice by yourself, practice in front of a mirror, practice with a friend. And get it to a point where you're not emotional or upset about what occurred. And I understand, I'm not saying it's not okay to be angry or sad or upset. I'm not saying that, but it's not in your best interest to show that type of emotion in an interview. So practice. And just be short and to the point. Our entire department was let go due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the catering company I'd worked for 16 years downsized myself and other staff. You don't need to say much more than that. If they want more information, they'll ask for more information. If you're having to relocate, you don't again need to give all the information. I understand that might be traumatic. There might be some really heavy things that have happened, and I'm so sorry if these things have happened to you. But you don't need to say that you've had to give up your car, or you've had to sell possessions, or you've had to move home because of financial situation. Just say, I'm moving closer to home to be closer to family. Just be, again, short and to the point, and practice this type of response if you feel you need to. So some questions are really, really very tricky, and one of the trickiest questions to answer is, have you ever been fired? How do you answer a question like that if you have been? Well, the trick here is to take full responsibility. Show that you've learned something, and talk about what steps you've taken and are continuing to take so it won't happen again. Now, you don't need to talk about everything that happened. You don't need to go into details, and like I said in the previous slide, you're going to have to practice, practice, practice. You want a canned response here. And hopefully this happened a long time ago, like maybe when you're in high school or something like that, and it's something that maybe 20 years later you really know not to do anymore. But if it hasn't been, really think about what occurred and how you're going to communicate that you've moved on and have made changes so it won't happen again. So another question that was typically considered quite tricky was, have you ever been incarcerated or convicted of a crime? And that was a question that often would appear on job applications. There would be a box and you'd have to check yes or no. Well, those days have changed. California has banned the box. That's no longer there. And so The idea in California banning this box and making it so it can't be on a job application, and please note that there are some exceptions. Look at the exceptions that are up on the screen there. The reason why they did want to get rid of that box in this question on job applications is so people might be given another chance to actually interview. Now, after the interview and they make an employment offer, yes, they can go and ask about this. And so if the answer is yes, you have been incarcerated, or yes, you have been convicted of a crime, you do need to know how you're going to respond. Okay, and take a lot of the cues from the previous slides I've been saying. Practice, practice, practice. You might not need to say every single thing that's happened, and you don't want to be emotional about your answer, but yes, if they do offer you the job, they can do a background check. Yes, they can go and ask you about this, and you do want to have a response. However, the idea is at that point, hopefully, you will have made enough of a relationship with them that they still want you. So I always believe that you should have a few questions to ask, and if you're allowed to ask questions, you definitely should ask something. And that shows that you're engaged with the interview process and the entire process itself, and that you want to work for the company. You'd be surprised at how many people just don't have any questions at all. If you don't really have much, maybe they've answered most of your questions, the question you should always ask is, what's the next step in the process? Just simply because it's good for you to have a timeline or a general idea of what's coming after this. And for whatever reason, they don't often share that with you until you ask. So always ask that. But some of these questions I think are just good to ask. Like, what would be a particular day in this position? Is there anything that you'd like to be better about the organization? Maybe you read something in your research about the company that you'd like to ask. Always be polite about your questions, but questions definitely show that you're engaged. Allison Green, who I talked a lot about in part 1 of this job searching workshop, suggests asking 2 questions during the pandemic. How has the pandemic affected your operations, and how has it changed how employees are working? And I think those are really, really great questions, and you can see where you can find out more information from her right there, and where you can find this article in which she suggests these 2 questions as well. Having more questions than you think you'll need is probably a good idea. Some of them will probably get answered, as I alluded to. But I also like to have them typed out on paper with a space to write the notes. That way it showed how prepared I was that I was engaged and I wanted to know more about the job. I mean, that should be part of the interview process, right? They want someone who's engaged with the process. So I talked about how they can't ask you your salary history, and they can't ask you what the value of like your benefits were. They can't ask you that type of stuff. And there's some other stuff that a good interviewer won't ask you during the interview process. They won't do that. And I've heard a lot of people refer to this type of stuff as, oh, well, there are these illegal interview questions. Well, that's not really correct. There's stuff that isn't a good idea to ask in an interview, but really they can ask you nearly anything. And you as a person being interviewed, you can answer. That's your own choice. But the thing is, a good interviewer won't ask certain questions because those questions, if they ask them, the information that they get back can't be used in the hiring decision-making process. They can't use it to decide not to hire you, for example. So if they do ask someone about some of these types of questions and they decide not to eventually hire you, well, they've just given such and such a person some ammunition against them. Well, you didn't hire me because I told you. See, so there are some questions that a good interviewer won't ask because they can't use that information to make decisions about whether they should hire you or not. And this is all due to protected classes. So what are protected classes? These are groups of people that employers can't discriminate against. That's what protected classes are. And so on the left-hand side, we have groups that are federally protected. And over on the right-hand side, because we live in the wonderful state of California, we have classes that are protected under California law. So they can't discriminate against any of these groups here in California because of these laws. That's really cool. So the thing is, employers can discriminate, but they can't discriminate when it comes to protected classes. And there can be a bit of a gray area here about this, though. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But the thing is, the word discriminate, when I use that, I'm not meaning it necessarily in the sense that we typically use it in society. I mean it as the employer can make choices. They can choose not to hire someone or choose to hire someone based on whether they meet the job requirements with reasonable accommodations. Okay? So, for example, they can require the person who gets the job to speak Spanish fluently. Okay? And they can require that. They can require you to show that you can speak Spanish fluently, maybe through a test or through the interview itself. And they don't have to hire you if you can't speak Spanish, because maybe the reasonable accommodation would be to hire a translator, and that's not something they consider a reasonable accommodation. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about that because there's some nuances here. Maybe they can't ask you where you learned Spanish, because if they asked you that, that could reveal national origin. Maybe they shouldn't ask you when you learned it, because again, that could reveal national origin, but also maybe your age. So there are some questions that maybe a good interviewer won't ask. Sure, they can ask you, can you speak Spanish? Can you show me that? But there are some related questions a good interviewer won't ask. Now, those pieces of information might come out during the interview, but a good interviewer won't be the one to ask you specifically about them. Another example might be the job requires heavy lifting, maybe up to 50 pounds. And please don't lift anything like this man down below. Oh my goodness. Don't do that. That's not correct. But, again, if you can't do that, well, what's a reasonable accommodation for you? If it's maybe wearing some sort of support belt, that seems pretty reasonable to me. But if they require a forklift, or for them to hire this man who can do this, well, maybe that's not so reasonable. So there is some gray area, and they, as the employer, gets to decide what's reasonable or not reasonable. Okay? Yes, you can litigate that in court. You can, and people have, but that's how this all works, for better or worse. And so ultimately, discrimination can be difficult to prove. And the other side of that, too, is that if someone asks you a question that maybe they shouldn't ask, it's not always intentional. It could be a mistake. Maybe they don't know. Or maybe it's just how the conversation evolved, too. And you'll need to decide how you want to answer questions that maybe shouldn't be asked. You can just answer it. You can. That's okay for you to answer it. If you want to do that, go ahead. You could also say, well, how is that question relevant to the job that I'm interviewing for? And see what they say. That might lead them to better phrase the question. But ultimately, you could decide what to answer, what not to answer, and how you want to answer it. I'm not trying to tell you not to pursue a discrimination claim. I'm not saying that. But the honest truth is, and I think most people are aware of that this can be a little difficult to prove. And that's partially because they can't take that type of information into account during the decision-making process. And so if they can show another reason why they didn't hire you, well, then that might just be enough. One final thing as I wrap up this section here is that if you have a medical marijuana card, be aware that right now that doesn't protect you. Okay? If they do end up testing you for marijuana while you're employed, that doesn't protect you from being let go or from them not hiring you if you should reveal that. So be aware of that. That could change in the next few years. It could. But right now, there's no protection for that. For all interviews, and this includes in-person or virtual ones, I do think you should have a copy of your resume, application, the job description. Have that readily available. And as I've alluded to, likely today this will be some sort of virtual interview, so it's helpful to have this stuff out because maybe you need to refer to something. You don't know what you're going to need during the interview always, and it's best to have all the things you need, right? I do think if you get nervous, having an outline of what you mentioned for tell me about yourself can be really helpful, maybe put you at ease. You may not need to use it, but it's good to have it. Pens. Have some pens available for yourself, something to write with and something to write stuff down on. A list of the interviewers' names and their positions. That is a really good thing to have with you just so you can call people by their name and know what their background is, right? And like I said earlier, a list of questions for them and have space on your sheet of paper to write answers. One final thing before we move to the next section. I do think if you are working, you should either take time off or schedule the interview on a day you do not work. I think you need to mentally prepare yourself, and I don't think it's really possible to do that when you're working. I don't. And I don't think you should try to shoehorn your interview into your lunch break. I don't. So take a little bit of time off, get ready for that interview, and I think that's a much better recipe for success. All right, so now that we've gone over a lot of information about preparing for interviews and good questions and bad questions and what have you with interviews, let's talk about the different types of interviews. So for our purposes here today, I'm dividing this into phone interviews and in-person interviews, and others may group interviews differently, and that's fine. Phone interviews done over the phone, obviously, but they can't see you and you can't see them. In-person interviews, they can see you and you can see them, and they could be done on site where you're all in the same location, or they could be done virtually. So these are the two basic types of interviews that I will be focusing on today. So I'm also not going to be talking about text interviews or email interviews or interviews done through social media. I've heard of these things happening. I don't think they're tremendously common today, although I think they're starting to happen just simply because some people are trying to figure out how to interview people during a pandemic. But I'm not going to focus on them here. So use the guidance I provide for other interview situations with text, email, social media interviews if you should ever encounter them. But I don't think you're going to see them very often. And if someone is trying to do that with you, be aware that it's not the most commonly accepted format to interview someone with. That being said, you still can come across some interesting interview situations, and sometimes they do make an awful lot of sense. One time I applied for an online teaching assistant position, and I did speak with someone from HR. That was the first step. But after I spoke with that person from HR, which really wasn't an interview, they basically set me up to be included in a class in which I was being taught how to be a teaching assistant for that university. And if I passed the class, I would be offered a teaching assistant position. And if I didn't pass the class, well, I wouldn't be. And you know what? I think that interview situation actually worked out really well because either you could do it or you couldn't. So let's move on to the first type of interview, the phone interview. Phone interviews are usually short, and they often are used to screen out candidates. But sometimes they can be just like a regular interview. Why do a lot of organizations and HR departments use these to screen out candidates? Well, they use them this way because oftentimes they might have 200 candidates, and maybe their applicant tracking system whittles it down to 50 people or 40 people, and that's still just too many to do Skype interviews or in-person interviews on site. Logistically, it's too much. And so they want to get through a lot of people really, really quickly, and they decide to do phone interviews. So how do you know if it's going to be a regular interview and not an interview being used to screen out candidates? Well, if it's a regular interview, they're not going to give you so much information about it. They may give you the time and place, and if you ask for it, maybe who's interviewing you. And remember, you should always ask that, right? But they're probably not going to give you a time limit on the interview. Now, of course, there may be a time limit. Maybe they've got another candidate coming in 2 hours after they're going to talk with you. But the interview essentially might go on as long as it can, or how long it should go on. If it's the latter part and they're trying to use the interviews to weed out weaker candidates, they likely have one candidate after another, after another, after another. Maybe there isn't a lot of downtime between each interview. And so you'll know that because they'll literally tell you the time frame. So they'll actually say it's going to be a 20-minute interview, and they're going to ask you 10 questions, and you'll have about 2 minutes to answer them. And they may say that there isn't going to be time to ask specific questions during the interview. And they may, when they're scheduling this, ask if you have any specific questions, just to get those out of the way and separate from the actual interview that you'll be having. So there's that. But also, the type of interview where they're trying to weed out people, that typically comes at the beginning of the process and not at the end. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So in such a phone interview where they are trying to get through as many people as possible to weed out people, remember, you may not have a lot of time to answer your questions or to ask questions yourself. But you still can ask them to repeat their question, which can give you a little bit more time to come up with a response. But you can also ask what the timeline is if they haven't offered that to you. So keep those two things in mind. If you find yourself going through an interview process in which they have one of these interview sessions where obviously they're trying to weed out people, don't take it personal. This is very normal. It's very common. And it's just simply due to the number of candidates they have. So try to be ready for that phone call. I would say at least 50 minutes. I would probably do at least 30 minutes early. Have everything ready, water, notepad, copy of your resume, get prepared and situated just in case anything goes wrong, right? And find a quiet place with a door that can close. Don't do this in a crowd or on a motorboat or with your Boy Scout troop. Maybe no, or at the beach. No, with this snazzy Radio Shack phone. No. I think there might be an inclination, if it's a short phone interview, let's just do it during a break at work or during lunch. And I really don't like that idea. Speaking from personal experience, I didn't feel as comfortable as I could have been because I couldn't control everything. What if somebody saw me or interrupted me? So I would still suggest taking the day off or taking the afternoon off. Be aware that phone interviews often can have multiple people on the line. I don't think they'll be snazzily dressed as these people from the 80s below, but it can be like a committee interview, even if it's one of these short interviews used to weed out people. So be prepared for that. So up until now, beyond the advice I was giving about phone interviews, a lot of the advice I've been giving was very general, just about interviews in, general, and could be applied to a lot of different scenarios. So now I'm going to get a little bit more specific, and we'll talk more about general interviewing skills, but we'll also focus a bit on how to do group interviews and how to interview well with a committee. And also, how do you do interviews virtually? Because any type of interview literally can be done virtually these days. And then briefly I'll talk about some scenarios, and you really can't control this, and you might not know this is going on, but it's an interview in which it's really not an interview because they already pretty much know who they're going to hire, and I'm sorry to tell you, it's not you. So in-person interviews, I am including virtual interviews here. And for our purposes, in-person interviews are going to be interviews where the parties can see each other. Virtual interviews were common before the pandemic, and they're becoming a lot more common. It's just simply for safety reasons. So, general advice for all in-person interviews. I think arriving early is always a good idea, and that goes for on-site interviews or even a virtual interview. Just simply because being there, being ready early, it gives you a cushion. If you're aiming to be there 30 minutes in advance, 45 minutes in advance, if anything goes wrong, if there's traffic or something prevents you from being there, you spill something on your shirt, you can go and adjust a bit and you don't have to stress so much. Even for a virtual interview, in advance you should have checked to make sure that the program was working correctly, that they can see you, can hear you, all that fun stuff. And even if the program logs you out for a virtual interview before the time, you can always log back in. For an on-site interview, yes, arrive early. But if you do arrive really early, okay, like 30 minutes, 45 minutes or more, just wait in the parking lot or someplace close by where you can collect yourself, and then maybe go to check into the interview at the place where you're supposed to, maybe 10 minutes beforehand. And that also gives you enough time to fill out any paperwork or whatever it is that they might want you to do. Sometimes they want you to do that stuff. But don't, for example, show up for a 2 p.m. interview and wait in the waiting room for 2 hours. That just makes you look a little weird. But certainly it's okay to go and show up early. Make sure you know where you're going, have a plan, and that way if something goes wrong, well, you're just prepared for that. Another thing that's a good idea for all in-person interviews is to have multiple copies of your resume, portfolio, whatever it is that you're bringing with you. If it's a virtual interview, in that case, one copy is enough of everything because it's really just for your reference and you've probably sent this stuff to them already. But if it's in person, have multiple copies. If they tell you you're going to be interviewing with 5 people in a committee, well, you know what? Maybe bring 10 copies of everything instead of 5. I one time had a scenario where I was told about 5 people. I was given 5 names of people I was going to interview with. Get there, they pulled in 2 more people at the last minute to interview me. And because I had extra copies of everything, I looked prepared. Also, bring copies of your references. Again, I think that just looks like you're being prepared, right? I one time had a woman ask me at the end of my second interview with them that she just wanted me to send her a copy of my references through email when I had a chance. And I said, oh, I have them right here for you if you'd like. And I literally just opened up my bag and handed them to her. So again, that just makes you look good, like you saw into the future and decided to be prepared, which is kind of what most employers would like their employees to be, right? What else? Well, dress appropriately. Well, what does that mean? Well, you should know your field. You have to know your field. But if you're really unsure about what you should wear for an interview, one trick, and this obviously worked better in pre-COVID times, but you could go before the interview around closing time and just watch people from a distance as they leave the office to see what they're wearing. That's an old trick. It's probably always best to dress a little bit dressier than what people typically wear to work, and if you do use that trick, maybe don't look on casual Fridays. But that being said, sometimes you just need to know your field, and in some fields a suit and tie is just way too much. It's overkill. But then in other fields, that's common everyday work attire. Do silence your cell phone, including notifications, and for virtual interviews, that would also mean silencing whatever notifications that are on the device you're using or on the computer, whatever it is around you. Those beeps can just be a little distracting. No gum, I think that's kind of obvious, but no gum, please. Okay, so one thing that might not be so obvious is to be a little careful with medications and caffeine. Now, I'm not talking about what you normally drink coffee-wise or what medications you normally take. I'm talking about specifically changing, as in lowering or increasing around the day of your interview that's not doctor-directed. Does that make sense? Just be a little careful because medication sometimes and caffeine can increase anxiety. Okay, caffeine especially can really increase anxiety. So if you normally just have 1 or 2 cups of coffee a day, this isn't the time to go and have 6 and an energy drink. Just be careful. It can make you a little bit shaky too, so something to think about. So some industries, they may still want to meet with you on site in person, and that does make sense still for some industries, like the restaurant industry, the retail industry. Any industry that requires you to be on site, yeah, that certainly does make sense. If being on site isn't required, well, you certainly can ask for virtual. They could always say no, but you can ask for it, and then you would need to decide how you want to proceed. If they do want to meet you on site for the interview, ask questions. That's okay. Ask about their preparations for COVID-19. What's changed at the organization? What about masks? Where is the interview going to be held? Is it outside in a ventilated area? This is new for everyone, and there might be some give and take here, might be some discussion. Maybe they haven't done much interviewing during COVID, and they'll need to figure some things out with you. And so some things, that might have been very common, like a handshake before, might not be something that's done anymore. Group interviews. Let's talk about group interviews. So group interviews are another way to whittle down candidates. They typically have had a large number of applicants, and they have to hire a large number of people quickly. So that's what a group interview is. And yes, they are becoming a lot less common during COVID because typically this would be done on site, and they have to get through a large number of people very quickly. In order to do that, you have to bring them into the same area, and that could be a super spreader event. But I have heard of this stuff sometimes occurring like in a Zoom-like environment, so I don't think it's terribly common, but it seems to be happening every once in a while. But let's put that aside for a moment. Typically on an on-site group interview, there could be hundreds of people there for this interview, and they will divide everyone up into smaller groups, and you'll interview as a group together. So they'll take your group, bring you into a room, maybe it's 10 people, and they'll ask you a series of questions, and they usually will ask everyone the same questions, go right around the room, and you'll have to think quickly and on your feet. So yeah, the goal here is to whittle down the few hundred applicants they had to the very best people that maybe they want to interview one-on-one with. And so your goal is to just survive this round, and you can get to a more normal regular interview. And like I said, yeah, it can be done in a Zoom-like environment. I think it could get a little unwieldy, but it certainly could be done that way. So the best advice I can give you for a group interview scenario is that they're quick and they're fast, and you just got to think on your feet, okay? And do pay attention. Don't just sit there waiting for them to get to you. Think about what your responses will be, because especially if you're not the first person being asked the question, you might have, sometimes 10 minutes to think about a response because other people are answering, and you'll want to listen to what they're saying too, because that helps you figure out how you could stand out and how you could be unique. And that's really important. You want to show them that you're one of the better people sitting there in that group interview, and you don't want to repeat word for word what other people have said or say, hey, what she just said, because I've seen people do that and it doesn't work out for them. They don't get called back. They get sent home when they do that. And that's a reality. A lot of people will not know how to get through this type of group interview, and they'll just repeat what other people have said. Also, please Be respectful of what other people are saying. This isn't the time to critique them. Yes, talk about how you would do it differently, but you don't have to do it in a disrespectful manner. One good thing with group interviews is that often you'll pretty much know right away if you've made it to the next round or not. And well, that's not always the case. Oftentimes they'll discuss on site who those people they want to interview a second time are. Maybe they do that in a separate room while you all wait, or maybe they send you out while they discuss, but they'll likely tell you right then and there who's making it to the next round. If not, they'll give you a call or communicate that later. And what will happen after they let you know is if you've made it to the next round, you'll get a more traditional interview. One thing to be aware about with group interviews is a lot of people are intimidated by them, and I think that's because they're common, but they're not that common, and so it's hard to get practice for group interviews. And the goal is for you, a candidate, to stand out in a good way. And one way that you can do that, if you didn't maybe stand out so well even in the interview part, is to take a moment to ask a question or two if there's an opportunity. And even if you're not given an opportunity, maybe ask if it's okay to ask a question. I mean, do it politely when there's a lull towards the end. But yeah, because that does make you stand out a bit, and if done in the right way, maybe it helps you become a little bit more memorable and maybe get another interview. And so questions that you could ask that would benefit probably everyone in the room could be about the timeline for things, if that hasn't been talked about. Or, hey, like, what's the best part about working for your company? That's always a good question to ask. So another really, really common way to interview people is interview by committee. Often they won't tell you that's what's going on, and that's why it is important that you ask who will be interviewing you, because often they will give you a list of people, and well, you can tell it's an interview by committee because you've got a group that will be interviewing you. And I think it's also a good way to prepare yourself mentally, because you would prepare yourself differently if it's just one person as opposed to 6 or 7. This can also be done virtually, and a lot of virtual interviews are done this way in a way that's similar to Zoom. And certainly a one-on-one interview could transform into an interview by committee. I mean, they could just pull somebody into the interview that day. And I think it's important to bring multiple copies if you are interviewing on site. Obviously, don't forget yourself. You need a copy for yourself, just in case, but have as many copies for the number of people that you were told were going to be there, and then a few extra. You never know. You want to be prepared for any scenario. So let's talk specifically about virtual interviews, and all those scenarios I've talked about can be transferred over to the virtual environment. If you're familiar with Skype, FaceTime, and Zoom, this is very similar to all of these things, and they could use those programs to interview you, but they may also use ones that are specifically made for interviewing people and made for HR departments. So you should test the program before, and like I said, show up early. So yeah, test the program the day of before you do the interview, but you should also test everything in advance. So that's not always an option with some of these programs that are specifically made for HR departments, but you could try Skype or FaceTime to see how that shows up. See that the audio is working, see that your visual is working, and do check your background. Make sure there's nothing distracting or something you don't want them to see, like a jacket you threw on the couch, is visible. Just straighten up a bit, right? And literally, it is just the background. At one time in our office, we needed to move some stuff around, and so we're using the office as a storage area too. And when I was doing the virtual interview, everything in the view looked perfect. But if we moved that computer around, it would have looked like a giant mess. And that's the thing, that's all that matters, is what's in the view. Make sure it's a quiet room too. You'll want to silence your phone, turn off the notifications for your computer. You don't want those beeping or making noises while you're doing the interview because that can be distracting, not just for the interviewers, but for you too. Maybe you want to use a microphone so there isn't the noise of traffic going by. And if you've got pets and children, maybe this is the time you want to go make sure someone is with them in another room. But sometimes things happen, and the best way to deal with it is just say, my dog is snoring. Laugh about it. Things happen. Sometimes children are children and they might run in. So it does humanize you. It makes you a real person. And I think most people are a little forgiving. Obviously, you want to try to make things as professional as you can. But, if your dog barks once or twice, I think the best thing to do is just laugh it off. So clothing is really important in a virtual interview. You want to see how it looks on camera too. And I think you should be professionally dressed throughout. What if you have to stand up? What if you have to grab something that you left a few feet over? There's some scenarios you will be really glad you were professionally dressed. And I think it also makes you feel like you're in an interview. Makes you feel better to be professionally dressed. Water, make sure you've got it. You don't want to go and suddenly realize you're thirsty and you're missing a drink. Have it there regardless if you think you'll need it or not. And committee interviews are pretty common in the virtual environment. If you're not familiar with how to do a committee interview, Zoom, just practice on Zoom with some friends. And that also brings up another point. If you're not used to being in a virtual environment and having yourself on camera, it might be time to get some practice. And again, there is a free version of Zoom, and just practice, practice, practice. Even practice with some time limits to see what it's like to have an interview and to have timed questions in an online environment. Now, I have to be honest, I've interviewed virtually quite a few times, and I actually prefer that because I'm at home and I can feel a little bit more at ease, and I can better control my environment and get myself into a better headspace. And I do sometimes, get a little stressed out. I have some anxiety, I get nervous, and I can just keep myself a little bit calmer, it seems, in virtual interviews. So that's something that you might find too, that you do end up liking this format better. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but sometimes organizations already have a candidate in mind that they want to hire, and they're required by HR to go through the hiring process and bring in other candidates. And so because they have an internal candidate and an external candidate, and they're made to do this, they have to post and they have to interview people. And sometimes there are clues that this is what's going on. Perhaps you're applying for the director of a specific department and you're doing research on the organization, and you notice that the assistant to the director has been there for 15 years. And you're wondering, well, why haven't they applied for this directorship position? And the reality is they very likely may have applied for it, and they might be the one that might get pushed into that position. Ideally, that would just be an internal posting, but sometimes HR requires them to look outside the organization. And sometimes it could also be the scenario that the job posting likely will be canceled, and HR is going through the process in case it's not canceled, and they want to be ready to have candidates for this position. So the reality is, in these scenarios, you won't always know this is going on, but they're just going through the motions. It's important to always be professional and remember that interviewing experience is experience. It is good for you. So you are ultimately benefiting from this. I would hope, however, that whatever this organization is looking for would not bring in candidates that require them to pay for travel across the country, or bring people in from far away when the interview could be done virtually. I would hope they wouldn't impose too much on these people at all, actually. Now, after any interview that you have, I think it's a good idea to send a thank you email within 24 hours. This should be just a thank you. You can elaborate upon something that was discussed, and I actually think that's a good idea, but don't make this email too long. It should mostly be thanking the people who interviewed you. So bear that in mind. And if you don't know who those email addresses are, a lot of times if you have the email address of one person at the company, you can use the same naming structure to figure out what the other email addresses are. Try not to be weird though. I've heard of people sending cards. I've heard of a guy one time who was interviewed and then he literally went out to his car and got one of those singing cards and brought it back in to say thank you. He actually got hired, believe it or not, because the interviewer thought it was so hilarious. But I don't think in most cases that would work. Above all, whatever you say in this thank you email is don't do the hard sell. Just you don't need to do that. Just say thank you and elaborate upon something and move on. So let's talk for a moment about interview advice and job searching advice that you might find online. And I talked about this in part 1. These articles, though, are beginning to proliferate again online during the pandemic. And the last time I saw so many articles about this, it was the Great Recession. And likely this happens because, well, people are out of work. The reality is a lot of these articles are just clickbait. They're not going to help you. They will benefit the person who wrote the article because you'll read them, but they're not going to benefit you because a lot of the advice is extreme and questionable. I saw one the other day that suggested, you know what, you don't need a resume, you don't need a cover letter, just forget about that, or applying actually at all, and just go stalk the company that you want to work for and become friends with the person in charge or the hiring manager, and he's just going to love you because you're a go-getter. No, 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 no. They don't want you stalking them and going to them during a pandemic. This guy who wrote it, maybe he did really love go-getters back in 2017 when he wrote the article. There's the thing. Written in 2017. It's being promoted as a new article, but written in 2017. Maybe he loved this back then, but you know what? Today, probably not so much because there's a pandemic going on. And you know what? It was weird advice back then in 2017 too. It may have worked for him, but it's not going to work in most situations. Thing is, the guy doesn't have a background in HR. He's not a hiring manager. Sure, he might run a company and maybe that's how he feels, but that's not common advice that's given by HR professionals or people who are hiring managers because it's annoying to most of them. They have other things to do than become your best friend and hear all your great ideas for a job that isn't even available right now. Okay? So the thing is, look to see who wrote the article, look even when it was written, and you know what? Trust yourself. If it seems crazy, if it seems weird, you know what? It probably is. And so the waiting process begins. Now, the reality is that it is going to take some time before you get a response, in most cases. Sometimes I've heard nearly right away, though. I have. But oftentimes not hearing anything just doesn't mean anything. Maybe they have other people to interview. They have other processes to go through. Maybe something else came up, and that could lead to a delay. If you were told you'd hear something after a week or two and you haven't, it's okay to inquire about the status of the job application. Just be short and to the point and just ask what's going on. That's all you need to do. If you are rejected, it's okay to ask for feedback. You may find that some HR departments won't give you that, and that might be a policy just to protect them. But some people will give feedback if you ask it. Be aware that that can be difficult to hear. I did that once and I didn't really enjoy it, although I learned some really helpful things. And I also learned how close I came to actually being offered that position, and the deciding factor was something I really couldn't control, in spite of the feedback he gave me that was helpful. I also kind of realized I didn't want to work for him. That's something I also realized too. So sometimes it is for the best and something much better comes along. All this being said, don't dwell too much on the interview. It's best to move on and keep applying and applying until you are offered a position that you decide to accept. Now, bear in mind, during the pandemic, this timeline may need to be extra flexible and you'll need to be a little bit more understanding because yes, someone in HR could get sick. The posting could also be delayed or canceled. And if HR was working on site and they had to start working remotely, or there are a lot of things that could happen here, and these things could just delay things. It's just taking longer for things to happen. So yeah, of course you want to keep your eyes open, look for red flags, but I think it's also good to just be a little understanding right now during COVID that sometimes response times could get a little delayed just due to the rapidly changing environment we live in. All right, so maybe you've interviewed for 5 positions or more and you don't have a job offer yet. All right, well, if you've gotten interviews, that means your applications and resumes and cover letters are working. But that likely means something is going wrong with your references or your interview skills aren't what you think they are. So the latter one is something you can work on your own or with a friend, and you can just get a lot more practice in. But the references, well, how do you figure that all out? Well, probably what the best course of action to do is not to confront your references, but to have a friend just call up your references and pretend to be somebody who wants to offer you a job and see what those references say about you. If they're not saying good things about you or they're not overly complimentary or great, maybe it's time to find a different reference. And you don't need to confront that reference. You don't need to do that. Just move on quietly. That's in your best interest, right? The reality is, if you've interviewed for 5 positions or more, the ball should have swung into your court at least once by this point. And maybe you chose not to accept it, but yeah, you probably should have gotten an offer. So great, you've been offered the job. That's really, really exciting. Of course, you don't have to accept. You get to choose what you do from here on out. Okay, you have an offer, you don't have to take it. Try to trust your gut. Think about what worked, what was good about what you were looking at, the people you met. Are you a good fit? Not just for them, but are they a good fit for you? That's really, really important, isn't it? And trust your gut. Sometimes I think when you've lost a job or you're going through this job searching process, we sometimes lose a little sight of ourselves and maybe we don't feel comfortable trusting our gut. But if something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And you might want to reflect on what that could be. And maybe you could reach out back to HR or to whoever your connection is and ask a few more questions if you have doubts. That might help you figure out what you want to do here. So after you've accepted the position and HR gives you a start date and you've signed everything and you've jumped through whatever hoops they want you to go through, now you've basically been hired by them. You've got that date on the calendar. And that's a really important date, okay? Because the thing is, now once you have gone through all that, now is the time to give notice to a current position that you have. Okay? You don't want to give notice before all this stuff has been completed, because the reality is sometimes job postings, they get canceled. And because you have an agreement, if they cancel the job after you have made this agreement, you have some leverage, okay? And so the thing is, yeah, you could go to your current employer and say, you know what, that job, it fell through. And some employers would be happy to have you. There are people out there, you know who they are, okay? But a lot of them might say, oh no, we've already started looking. A lot of them might feel you had a foot out the door and you were ready to bail on them, and why would they keep you around? So the thing is, there are people who have given notice before this agreement and then find out they've got nothing. So wait until you have an agreement, wait till you've got a start date. If things fall through, then you've got some leverage with this new employer, and maybe you can negotiate some severance or a few months of pay. And obviously, you don't have to accept. As I've said, oftentimes it's stressed that you should be a good fit for the employer, but the employer should be a good fit for you too. If there's anything you take from this, remember that. Things should be good for you too. California is an at-will state, so a little bit more about giving notice here. Because California is an at-will state, no notice is required. So that means you can literally walk out today if you want to leave your job. But that doesn't mean that's the best thing for you, right? And while it's true that California is an at-will state and the employer can terminate the relationship too without notice, you probably should give some notice to leave the job. And 2 weeks is typically what's considered best. It might be longer in some industries, but think about how other people have been treated. In some places, it might be okay to give a few weeks notice. If you've seen that and you have a good working relationship with your boss and the employer, that might be perfectly fine. But if you've noticed that people who give notice are sent home that day, that might also be how they treat you. And you have to do what's best for you. You really do. So if you need 3 weeks of salary, you might not want to give notice 3 weeks beforehand or 2 weeks notice. If that's been the case, do what's best for you. And so leaving, try to focus on the good. This isn't the time to burn your bridges or act on grudges or hold grudges or write that letter to everyone in the company saying what's wrong. Don't do that, please. I know that might make you feel better, but ultimately that's not in your best interest. And a good employer should want to be happy for you too. And because the reality is that everyone leaves. There isn't somebody who stays forever. Like, think about it. People either go to a new opportunity, they either retire, or forbid that it should happen, they pass away on the job. I mean, in all those circumstances, somebody does leave the job. At some point, everyone does. It's just part of the process. When you leave, keeping in touch is always a good idea, just simply because, well, you might need these people someday. Maybe you need them as a reference, or maybe they become a future client, or maybe even a future coworker, or they have an opportunity for you. And maybe you go back to that organization if you liked working there. So it's a good idea to keep in touch, and you can do that, through getting coffee or going up for drinks every once in a while, or maybe just doing it through LinkedIn. It's all up to you. And it's always a good idea to keep your resume up to date. You never know when a new opportunity might arise, and it's good to have that, pretty much ready to go. Maybe tweak it a bit, but, have something there for yourself. All right, so this was part 2 of our job searching workshop. So in part 1, which is also posted on the Palm Springs Public Library's YouTube channel, you might want to check that out. We talk about the current situation during the pandemic a little bit more in depth, and I talk about things that you can do to prepare before you start the job application process, and I also talk about all the fun things like resumes, cover letters, and references. So that's all on the Palm Springs Public Library's YouTube channel. So our library, on our website, the Palm Springs Public Library website, which is palmspringslibrary.org, you can see it right there, you can find a lot of resources for job searching, and one of those is Job Now. And you might not find everything helpful there, and you should use your own judgment, as I've been stressing throughout both workshops. But they have job coaches, they do have resources that might prove helpful. Also, I talked about askamanager.org, which is a website by Allison Green, who is an HR professional. And also in the previous workshop, I talked about evil HR lady. Suzanne Lucas is the evil HR lady. And I understand Allison Green and Suzanne Lucas are friends. And they both are wonderful. And they have a lot of great information about the hiring process and interviewing. And I can't sing their praises highly enough. And both these workshops are highly indebted to them. So check out their sites. If there's something I haven't answered here, chances are they have on their blogs. And if you do require books or you need additional assistance, you can always call our library at 760-322-7323, and a librarian would be happy to help you. And if you do want to get in touch with me, you can give me a phone call at the library, 760-322-7323, or you can email me at scott.biegen@palmspringsca.gov. One more thing, okay? And I said this in part 1. Don't give up. Don't surrender, okay? Sometimes you just got to keep plugging away. Keep trying and trying and trying and trying until someone says yes. It's going to happen for you. It really will, okay? And just think about what's worked and what hasn't worked and learn from it. That's really all you need to do. If you keep trying, at some point, someone will give you that opportunity. All right? Best of luck to all of you.